In previous episodes of the Isla project, a wide array of life has been shown in quick succession, which may lead one to believe that much of the planet is extremely biodiverse. While this is true in areas with an abundance of light and resources, it's important to understand that many other regions are extremely barren. Areas more than 50 degrees north or south of the Terminator have little to no complex life. Those to the north have plenty of light available, however, extreme heat and a lack of moisture make it exceedingly difficult for life to take root. To the south is an endless night. Warmed only by ocean currents, these latitudes are largely incapable of supporting terrestrial photosynthetic life. Thanks to these conditions, the regions beyond positive or negative 50 degrees latitude tend to be populated by autotrophic species which use sources of energy aside from light to survive, predominantly chemosynthetic and kinetosynthetic organisms. All this being said, there are many environments on Isla that are full of life, and most of the species featured in this series inhabit such places. Typically located within 30 degrees of the Terminator, such environments include forests and plains with consistent precipitation. A few specific examples were covered in episode 1, however, we will dive into even more in the future. Each of the biodiverse environments shown up to this point have been terrestrial, so for this episode, we are going to shift our focus away from the land and instead examine the sea. Isla's ocean environments aren't limited by the atmospheric conditions which govern the development of life on land. With more stable temperatures and less extreme weather, ocean life has opportunities to flourish in ways that would be impossible in terrestrial environments. Regions along the coast are where the majority of marine life will be found on Isla. Nearshore environments within the Terminator region are more dimly lit, limiting their capacity to harbor photosynthetic life. Nevertheless, certain specialized species call them home. Travel a little farther north, however, and one can find bays, estuaries, and reefs comparable to those on Earth. Located just north of the Terminator region, one can find an environment known as the marine sand plains, our subject for today. In this style of video, which I'm calling a biome spotlight, we will look at the various species which call this environment home, examining each as a component of an interconnected food web. We will start at the bottom of the trophic pyramid, discussing the photosynthetic flora of the sand plains, and then work our way up, ultimately reaching the apex predator of this ecosystem. This is the Isla project. Before we discuss the inhabitants of the marine sand plains, let's get acquainted with the scenery. This environment is characterized by expansive stretches of sand which extend out from the coast with very minimal change in topography. The sand plains are found in shallow water, rarely ever exceeding 15 meters in depth. This means that all areas are constantly bathed in light and perfect for harboring photosynthetic life. Some areas near the coast have an abundance of rocks and boulders just below the surface. Features like this can provide diverse habitats and shelter for aquatic species, so we see significant niche partitioning in these less exposed areas. The marine sand plains, while being highly exposed to light, lack many essential nutrients in the substrate, which limits the abundance of autotrophs and forces those that do take root to specialize. Now that we have a lay of the land, we can introduce the various species which inhabit these seas. At the base of any trophic pyramid are the producers of the environment. These are autotrophic organisms, which means that they produce their energy passively through environmental resources, such as chemical compounds, kinetic energy, or light. In the case of Isla's sand plains, most autotrophs are photosynthetic. The smallest species we will find are phytoplankton, located within the water column. Like the plants on land, most utilize black photopigments in order to capture as much light as possible. Some phytoplankton encapsulate themselves in a hard silicate layer called a frustule, which protects them from the environment around them as they drift within the currents. These structures are reminiscent of the cell walls of other photosynthetic organisms, providing structure and protection for the cell or cells inside. The frustules of many phytoplankton also utilize crystalline nanostructure to amplify and direct the light entering the organism, optimizing its absorption. These silicate structures come in many shapes and sizes and are so robust that they can be found in the sands of the plains long after the organism inside has died. Phytoplankton are extremely successful in Isla's oceans, and it's not uncommon to see their populations explode in light-exposed areas, creating enormous gray blooms that fill the water column. Interestingly, the abundance of phytoplankton is vitally important not just to the ecosystems of the seas, but also to that of the entire biosphere, as they produce up to half of all oxygen in Isla's atmosphere. There are countless species of phytoplankton within the oceans, and they are by no means found exclusively in the sand plains. Rather, they make up the backbone of most marine ecosystems, the only exceptions being regions of the sea where light is so scarce that photosynthetic life cannot thrive. Another important category of producer in the marine sand plains is algae. Like the phytoplankton, many species take on a black coloration. However, there are a few divergent phyla that utilize a red photopigment instead. For example, the species Rubramintha tomentosus. Found carpeting the sandy shallows, these organisms grow and multiply at a rapid pace. If it weren't for primary consumers on the next level of the food web, populations of these algae would not be kept in check and their numbers would explode. This species is multicellular and grows in large colonial masses anchored to the seafloor by a network of branching filaments. Interestingly, this structure does not belong to the algae itself, but instead is a completely different species of aquatic saprotroph. This term describes an organism which derives nutrients from decaying matter by secreting enzymes into its environment in order to digest its food, which is then absorbed and consumed. When it comes to marine environments, species like this are typically found in tropical regions such as the sand plains, as warmer temperatures can better support a saprotrophic lifestyle. Unlike the red algae, the anchoring organism has a much more complex metabolism, which could only be supported by these tropical water temperatures. As I mentioned before, much of the substrate of the sand plains is lacking in certain nutrients, and thus, the life utilizing it has had to adapt, often finding alternative means of acquiring these essentials. In the case of the anchoring organism, a symbiosis with photosynthetic algae gives it a secondary means of sustenance in the form of shared nutrients. In return, the algae receives an easy means of anchoring to the substrate, as well as nutrients shared by the organism on which it resides. Another autotrophic inhabitant of the sand plains is the bizarre Polyvelus bulbosus, a photosynthetic species which is larger than the aforementioned alga, however, in a strange twist of biology, one which is far less structurally complex. This is because Polyvelus bulbosus are composed of a single cell. Macroscopic unicellular species such as this are rare on both Earth and Isla. However, in certain aquatic environments they are highly successful and can proliferate across the marine landscape. Bulbosus is no exception, and in some areas, individuals can be found carpeting the sandy bottom, outcompeting the colonies of algae we previously mentioned. Strange organisms like this are capable of growing so large thanks to a special adaptation which allows them to decentralize maintenance of the cell, the distribution of multiple nuclei throughout their internal workings. Most individuals have anywhere from 8 to 12 nuclei spread across the 3 main segments of the cell. 2 to 3 are typically found in the rhizoid, the root-like filaments which anchor the organism to the sand. Another 2 to 3 are located in the spindle, which extends upward from the sea floor. And finally, 4 to 5 nuclei are found in the bell, the primary energetically productive region of the cell. With multiple nuclei containing its genetic material, Polyvelus bulbosus is able to maintain itself by producing the necessary proteins in the segregated regions where they're needed, rather than relying on a single nucleus to provide for the entirety of the abnormally large cell. This species reproduces asexually, and when doing so, nuclei in the rhizoid bud off from the parent cell and grow outward below the surface of the sand. Eventually, the daughter nucleus becomes independent and replicates, growing a spindle and bell of its own. Thanks to this local reproduction, Polyvelus bulbosus typically grow in large swaths along the sediment, forming tiny forests of unicellular organisms. The final producer we will be discussing today grows into the water column, reaching heights of over 8 meters. Neoradix regalis is a type of flora which anchors itself to the sand using a collection of roots. From here, it extends up to the surface of the water, where it grows the leaf responsible for most of its photosynthesis. This leaf tilts backward above the waves and is kept buoyant by a plate floating on the water below it. These leaves always grow facing north, as this is the position in the sky where Isla's star resides. Neoradix regalis are crucial for generating verticality in the water column of the sand plains. Some species swim among their various stems, seeking safety and shelter from larger predators. Others like to spend their time just below the floating plate at the surface, where they can feed on small marine invertebrates that encrust upon the underside of the organ. On the next level of any food web are the primary consumers, which typically feed on the producers below them. One of the most ecologically important groups of primary consumers are the zooplankton, tiny microscopic organisms that predominantly feed on their smaller photosynthetic counterparts. Zooplankton themselves are a vital source of food for many other creatures in the sand plains, and thus, alongside the previously mentioned producers, they serve as the backbone for most aquatic ecosystems. Plankton, by definition, are incapable of maneuvering themselves against the currents in their environment, and so, this classification includes both unicellular life as well as larvae of native species that begin life too small for powerful locomotion. Many of these zooplankton are the spawn of species which release enormous quantities of young into their environment. Once they grow and develop, many will move from this position on the food web and go on to fill other ecological niches. As was previously stated, one of the most readily accessible sources of food in this ecosystem are the mats of algae growing along the sea floor. Producers such as these grow quickly and reproduce fast, which makes them a reliable source of food for organisms such as the small schooling species Crassiglia arenicolis. In the previous episode, we briefly touched on the clade to which this species belongs, Diplogastra, also known as the aquatic eelworms. Crassiglia arenicolis is one of the strangest species belonging to this clade, as their morphology and behavior has diverged greatly from that of their relatives. Typically, eelworms swim head first, undulating their long bodies behind them to generate propulsion. Arenicolis, however, swims backward, with a more rigid tail structure leading. Instead of using its form to generate thrust, it uses a long ventral proboscis to push off of the sand and propel itself along the sea floor. In eelworms, this proboscis organ is actually a secondary stomach, which is used to pre-digest food before it is injected into the mouth and primary digestive tract. While it still uses the organ for this function, Crassiglia arenicolis has evolved to also use it as a means of locomotion. With the help of small hair-like cilia lining its body, the proboscis enables the small eelworm to traverse the sandy bottom with surprising agility. This species is typically found in large schools containing hundreds of individual fish. Together, they hop along the marine landscape in waves, feeding on the sheets of algae growing in the sand. Another primary consumer inhabiting the sand plains is Nemecathis arenatus, a small herbivorous creature which clings to the stems of larger flora. Nemecathis arenatus is an ancient relative of Isla's terrestrial diundecapods and belongs to one of the few remaining aquatic groups, a taxonomic class called Haplobranchia. This animal moves slowly as it chews through species such as Polyvelus bulbosus, ripping them apart with a pair of highly dexterous mouths. Because the mobility of this species is limited, it has evolved to protect itself using concentrated toxins in its skin. In coordination with a bright yellow coloration which warns predators of its noxious condition, Arenatus is a textbook example of aquatic aposematism, when an organism telegraphs its toxic nature through flashy visual means. This condition results in Nemecathis arenatus having very few natural predators. Only a few have adapted to withstand the chemicals housed within the small creature, one of which we will touch on later. On the next rung of the food chain, we have secondary consumers, which feed on species of the previously mentioned categories. These species are typically carnivorous or omnivorous, and often larger than those on which they prey. The first secondary consumer we will discuss is a larger species of eelworm belonging to the same group as the aforementioned Crassiglia arenicolis. This distant relative, known as Cyrilucris ciliatum, spends its time patrolling the seafloor looking for smaller, typically less mobile prey items. Favorite food sources include smaller benthic invertebrates which shallowly burrow themselves in the substrate. These invertebrates often have hardened calcified shells protecting them, and this defense can be a hindrance on digestion for many predators looking to consume them. Eelworms, as we discussed earlier, have evolved a means to bypass this, a secondary or auxiliary stomach which extends from their head and, depending on the species, can be used as a proboscis, a manipulation organ, or a sort of biological stilt. When it comes to Sirelucris ciliatum, the secondary stomach is used entirely for feeding and helps the creature to dig through the fine sands of the seafloor and pull out its prey. When it finds a target, it works them out of the substrate by gripping them with the pseudo-mouth at the end of this organ, proceeding to pull it into the auxiliary stomach. Over a short period, the shells, typically composed of calcium carbonate, are worn away by digestive enzymes in the organ as well as physical wear. Once the prey has been suitably pre-digested in this stomach, it is then ejected into the eelworm's true mouth and introduced into its primary digestive tract where it can be fully consumed. Sirelucris ciliatum are fairly solitary creatures and can be found scouring areas of the sandy shallows. By slowly undulating their long bodies, they can patrol the seafloor at a steady pace, scanning below them using a downturned pair of eyes and an array of electrically sensitive hairs. The next two organisms we will examine belong to the same taxonomic family, a classification of organisms known as Oracilidae. To explain their morphology, we will look at another secondary consumer, a creature which peacefully drifts above the floor of the sand plains, the species Oridia spinacalis. Suspended by a gas-filled abdomen, species belonging to Oracilidae maintain a delicate buoyancy, allowing them to weightlessly hover above the hardscape of the marine environments they call home. This abdomen commonly takes on a bright coloration, and from its base extends a long feeding organ which reaches down to the sea floor. At its tip, there is a highly dexterous mouth, which in the case of Oridia spinacalis is specialized for ripping apart plant matter and small benthic creatures. In addition to its use for feeding, the mouth and oral stalk are also important for the mobility of the organism. Using the two, the creature can both anchor itself to and pull itself along the sea floor. This locomotion is aided by 6 long, tendril-like arms that also protrude from the underside of the Oracilid's abdomen. At the tip of each arm is a keratinous hook and a pair of smaller tentacles. Together, these implements can probe spinacalis' environment and grab onto physical features such as rocks, muddy substrate, or the stalks of flora growing up from the sand. Oracilidae is a diverse family of organisms, and most of its members share these morphological features with Oridia spinacalis. This solitary species can be found hovering above the seafloor, typically preferring areas with more physical features such as rocky outcroppings. These regions aid its mobility and provide a degree of shelter. Nevertheless, one can occasionally be seen crossing the flat and more sparsely populated stretches of sand characteristic to the biome. This is typically done in order to access new food sources. Oridia spinacalis are ravenous organisms, in part because a full stomach directly helps them to maintain their position in the water column. This is because communal bacteria residing within the creature's gut aid in digesting its contents, and as a byproduct, release gases into the abdomen which help to keep the Oracilid buoyant. Another secondary predator of the sand plains, and another member of the family Oracilidae, is Brevicales crocolata, a species characterized by its bright yellow coloration and shorter oral stalk. Unlike some of its taxonomic relatives which passively scour the seafloor in search of food, this organism is an active hunter. This behavior is aided by its stockier stature, which makes it easier to maneuver close to the ground and allows it to chase down any slower prey which seek to escape. A favorite prey of Brevicales crocolata is the aquatic diundecapod species previously showcased in the food web of the marine sand plains. Brevicales crocolata is one of the few species that can hunt this organism, as they've evolved a natural resistance to the poison found within its skin. Instead of being harmed by this toxin, the predator can consume its prey unscathed, and in doing so, ingest the deadly compounds and incorporate them into its own physiology, granting them a new chemical defense. Before reaching a mature stage of their life cycle, individuals of this species have yet to hunt any Nemacanthus arenatus, and thus have not had the opportunity to incorporate any of their poison. During this younger period, they are far more vulnerable to predators. However, they have evolved a means of deterring such threats. Like the prey they hunt, Brevicales crocolata take on a bright yellow coloration, which warns predators that they're poisonous even if they have yet to feed and accumulate enough toxins for this to be the case. This coloration evolved to deter the predators that both species shared, as those which had learned to avoid the brightly colored Nemacanthus arenatus could ultimately do the same with this oracilid species. Finally, we get to the tertiary consumers of this ecosystem, those species which are not preyed upon and thus are the apex predators within the food web of the sand plains. Typically, this classification contains the fewest number of species, as well as the lowest total biomass of any rung on the food chain. In the case of this ecosystem, there is only one apex predator, a species known as Dorensatus elegans. This organism grows to more than 1.5 meters long and patrols the water column in search of prey. It does this using sensitive electrosensory cells, as well as 3 pairs of eyes, each oriented at different angles. This species has excellent eyesight, and thanks to a pair of eyes facing upwards, another facing downwards, and more to the side, its visual field covers a full 360 degrees around its head. This aids in its generalist hunting behavior, as prey could be located above it by the water's surface or below, closer to the seafloor. Rather than specializing in hunting a single species or group of species, Dorensatus elegans will go after a wide range of prey items. In some cases, they will pursue Cyrilucris ciliatum. These are close to its own size, so it relies on a pair of powerful jaws to attack it. Ciliatum are capable of putting up a fight against the predator, so Dorensatus elegans often resorts to killing its prey by causing it to bleed out. Fights like this often draw the attention of hemophagic species like Haemophilus blandus, a micropredator which we discussed in episode 3. Dorensatus elegans are highly intelligent, and though they are predominantly solitary hunters, it's not uncommon to observe them working together to corral schools of Chryssiglia arenicollis, ultimately picking off any individuals that fall behind from the group using the long oral arm which protrudes from above their jaws. In its ancestors, this organ was an auxiliary stomach, much like that utilized by the aforementioned eelworms. In the case of this apex predator, however, this appendage has lost its digestive properties and has evolved to grab at and manipulate its environment instead. When hunting much smaller prey like this, the oral arm is used to snatch up individual fish and move them to the mouth where they can be consumed. Interestingly, play is often observable in young Dorensatus elegans. This behavior is most commonly displayed in species like this, which occupy higher positions on their respective trophic pyramids. Like many other predatory species, playing often mimics the hunting and fighting that are necessary in adult life. In the case of Dorensatus elegans, juveniles target a species that isn't normally part of their diet, Iridia spinacollis. As we previously discussed, this is a species which is less mobile and as a result is far less capable of putting up a fight. When it comes to play hunting oracilids like this, repeated jabs at the gas-filled abdomen can fatally puncture the creature's soft exterior and is a chance for the juvenile Dorensatus elegans to practice using their oral arm on targets which require far less precision. A lack of natural predators allows this behavior to be advantageous, as the extra expenditure of energy won't leave them vulnerable or susceptible to becoming prey themselves. These juveniles rarely ever consume the oracilids that they kill during play. However, the carnage often draws in scavengers looking to eat the newly exposed innards of Iridia spinacollis. Despite its voracious appetite, Dorensatus elegans do not always have access to reliable food sources. These species have vast ranges of ocean that they patrol, and this means that they'll inevitably spend time in the more barren, sparsely populated areas of the marine sand plains. In instances such as this species will swim less actively. Instead of undulating their entire body, they will only use the fins on the sides for propulsion, thus conserving energy. This concludes the web of life contained within Isla's marine sand plains. A diverse array of both autotrophic and heterotrophic organisms which together form a healthy and productive food chain. Each of the species we covered are a part of major aquatic clades, and we will eventually see more of their phylogeny when we examine other marine ecosystems. The goal of this episode was not to deeply explore any single one of these species, but rather to illustrate and examine the shared environment which they all inhabit. In the next installment of this series, we will return to land and discuss the migrations of various species as they traverse a variable terrestrial environment. That's all for this episode. Until next time.